Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, April 12th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the 2024 presidential election and the Republican and Donald Trump strategy of adopting the same talking points in the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election and what this means for this coming November. Now, CNN first reported today about Donald Trump and Mike Johnson. Mike Johnson is the new Speaker of the House of Representatives. He replaced Kevin McCarthy and pretty much has laid a low profile for himself over the past few years that he's been in Congress, and now over the past few months that he has served as Speaker of the House. He really hasn't been as prominent of a figure as Kevin McCarthy or Mitch McConnell or practically any other major Republican across this country, but now he's starting to move in silence in a way that could be very detrimental to the Republican Party. Donald Trump and Mike Johnson supposedly have been meeting very frequently, talking about this 2020 election and building an alliance on the falsehood of saying that this election in 2020 was stolen. Now, this comes at a time that Laura Trump, who recently took over the RNC as the RNC co-chair, that was after Ronna McDaniel was ousted after Donald Trump requested that she be removed, in which his, family member decided that she was going to run, and with the Trump name, ultimately came out ahead with a victory, now is running the Republican National Committee. Now, in this decision to run it, now it means that Donald Trump has a direct family and personal tie to the RNC. Typically speaking, they operate independently and do coordinate on some efforts, but now it looks like it's going to be all of them. And in this new decision to do a robocall saying there was massive fraud in the 2020 election, it seems as if the Republican Party is very much going to adopt the same exact talking points that lost them the 2022 midterm elections. Now, let's get this first out of the way. The majority of the country does not believe that this election was rigged. Donald Trump has been operating under this idea that he has touted at rallies and in RNC meetings and amongst his own advisors that 82% of Americans believe the 2020 election was rigged. And yet in all, very much accurate polling, you see this consistently as a fact. Roughly 2/3 of this country believes that the 2020 election was a free and fair election, does not buy into this idea that it was rigged, and the only people who really do, not Democrats, not independents, it's Republicans. Around half of Republicans, a little bit more than that, believe that the 2020 election was rigged. And that's because Donald Trump is someone who has been, revered in this party for quite some time now, has been saying it consistently that the election was stolen. But even with that, just half of the Republican Party believes that at its core, and it means that this is not a popular stance. It also shows, back in 2022, there were direct impacts of taking stances like calling the 2020 election rigged. For instance, Doug Mastriano went so far as to being someone who had attended January 6th, but a big purpose, that he was running on was that he was going to make elections secure in Pennsylvania. There was a lot of concern about who was going to be elected the next governor in this state because the governor has unilateral control over who the Secretary of State is and consequently many election rules. And so when Doug Mastriano was running on a platform that he was going to make the elections stronger and make the elections not rigged and do all of these different things, it made it so voters were entirely turned off by this line of messaging because a significant number of Pennsylvania voters, similar to this country, 2/3 believe the election was not stolen. And so when you have a mainstream Republican candidate running on this issue, an issue that the American public does not align with them on, coupled with abortion, again, another issue that the American public does not align with them on, you find that these candidates tend to underperform. It wasn't just Pennsylvania, though. In Arizona, Carrie Lake made it a focus of her campaign, and even in the aftermath of losing the governorship, she refused to concede the race. It wasn't as if she was saying that there was maybe some issues with election fraud, but, Katie Hobbs ultimately ended up winning, that the election margin was narrow enough that she had concerns about whether or not the election rules and, the voter rolls were intact and all of these different things. I mean, it certainly would have been still something we could have criticized and said that this was still denying the results of the election. But fundamentally, she said that this election was stolen from her, that she was the rightful governor of the state of Arizona. And she had continued that for months on end. And now that she's running for Senate, she's pivoting and saying, the 2020 election was rigged. I'm not going to talk about my election, but she's still re-emphasizing that the 2020 election was rigged, but trying to tone it down. But at the end of the day, these Trump Make America Great Again Republicans are so closely associated with this effort to overturn the 2020 presidential election, and they really need to do everything they can to distance themselves from that. And for many of them, they have been trying. But it becomes increasingly more difficult when the RNC itself is sending out robocalls saying there was massive fraud in the 2020 election. You look at Donald Trump too and Mike Johnson feeding into this idea that the 2020 election was stolen. I think Mike Johnson is doing what makes sense for him politically. He's a Republican from Louisiana who was recently elected as Speaker of the House of Representatives and quite frankly is boring. He doesn't have much political power. He doesn't have much, political pull. He is just a figurehead for the National Republican Party when they went through multiple iterations of voting and could not find a speaker. So he needs to attach himself on to whoever is the most powerful member of the GOP, and in this case, that is Donald Trump. There was a reason why Kevin McCarthy on his own was respected in the GOP. He was able to distance himself from Trump enough while still towing the line on many major partisan issues. But fundamentally, Mike Johnson and Donald Trump are becoming one. Fundamentally, the RNC and the Donald Trump campaign are becoming one, and it is all feeding into this echo chamber amongst themselves that this is a winning strategy for the 2024 election. I think that Republicans have yet to learn from the mistakes they made in the 2021 runoff elections in Georgia, when Donald Trump campaigned heavily for 2 months on end that the election was stolen in this battleground state, that Joe Biden and Brad Raffensperger worked together to ship in ballots from China or ship in ballots from different regions of the country and made them vote blue, and so Joe Biden won the election because it was stolen. And you found that turnout dipped, and it wasn't because voters were saying, I'm not voting for Trump because he said the election was stolen. Those Republicans here certainly were not doing that. Independents, sure. There were plenty of independents who switched over to vote blue or just simply stayed out of the runoff election where they otherwise might have voted red because of Donald Trump's claims. But this is specific to Republicans where turnout should not have decreased, no matter what. And what you find is that the voter drop-offs, the highest parts of it are in these rural areas. You look at the Atlanta metro area, has some of the lowest voter drop-off. But in some of the most conservative areas, like Marjorie Taylor Greene's district up here, you saw a depreciation rate compared to the general election of 19 to 24% in terms of Republican turnout. And so all of this voter turnout, all of this dipping in terms of support for the Republican Party was largely because Republicans did not turn out in the runoff election because they believed the election was rigged. Nobody wants to vote in an election where they think their vote doesn't count, and I think that's where we really saw this method backfire on the GOP. And then again, when it was brought back up in 2022, it became a prominent issue. Two hands of it. One, Republicans aren't exactly excited to turn out in an election where they already think that it's going to be rigged. On the other side of it, too, you find that independent voters, and of course, Democratic voters who might be inclined to stay home because they don't typically vote, are terrified of people who believe that elections are rigged when they don't go their way. I mean, I think we were very shocked when Doug Mastriano conceded the 2022 governorship because many people looked at this and said, this is a guy who quite literally attended January 6th. In no reality does he concede this election, and yet he did, but for many Republicans, they simply did not. And it became a problem and continues to be one. Donald Trump's policies are not popular amongst the American public, and the more and more that he adopts this similar, a policy position on the 2020 election, the more voters he is going to turn off. I've been talking about this for a while, but I've been mentioning how Donald Trump really has victory today. He does not need to change the way he is talking about issues today. In fact, can win over more voters by moving towards the center. But that just isn't Donald Trump. And that isn't his Republican Party of today. The RNC now is Donald Trump. The Speaker of the House is Donald Trump. This is all becoming the Donald Trump Party, and that is a problem for the Republican Party in this election. You take a look at where we were. Let's go ahead and find the, let's see if they can actually show us here. Maybe they won't because it's too far out. But, looking back at the 2024 Republican primary here, when Donald Trump had a tremendous lead over Nikki Haley and all the other candidates at times when they were in the race, but you still saw a considerable portion of that party decide to distance themselves from backing him in the 2024 election again. And I think there's a reason for that. When you look at, who's upset, who was looking at this and said, this is not the Republican Party that I voted for with John McCain or Mitt Romney, they sometimes did vote for Donald Trump. In 2016, they absolutely did. I think many of them saw Hillary Clinton as more of a threat than they saw a Donald Trump presidency. But it's more in the fact that in 2020, a number of them flipped over to the Democratic Party. I mean, you take a look at some states where Mitt Romney did phenomenally in, for instance, in Georgia, and you see that even then, Donald Trump did worse in 2016, and then you also find, what would be more better of a visualization would be doing it on here. This is map.jacksonjude.com if you want to go to it. Super, super helpful. I really, really appreciate it. But 2012 versus 2016 should have been an indicator of warning signs of where strategies like Donald Trump's may not be super effective. On one hand, they were very effective in states like Iowa, like the ones that swung by 15 points, or Wisconsin, 8 points. Michigan, 10 points. Pennsylvania, 6 points. Ohio, 11 points. But look at this Sunbelt region. The region of the country where Donald Trump lost in 2020. Georgia and Arizona in specific. Arizona swung 6 points to the left. Georgia swung 3 points to the left. And the reason why this matters is because Hillary Clinton significantly underperformed Obama in this election. She lost Iowa. She lost Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maine's 2nd district here. And compared to the Obama states from 2008, she lost Indiana. She lost North Carolina. Take a look at this shift from 2008. But it further exemplifies my point here. Even in Obama's 365 electoral vote, technical speaking, landslide, at least for modern politics here, Georgia still voted more blue in 2016, and so did Arizona, and so did Texas. So the 2012 to 2016 swing is a little bit more emphasized because 2008 was a phenomenal year for the Obama campaign for the Democratic Party. But look how much redder the rest of the country is, and look how much bluer these other parts are. And compared to 2020, you see it truly. Georgia, Texas, Arizona, even Virginia swung to the left. And so my point here is that these states are not the states that appreciate this rhetoric from Donald Trump very heavily. And yet they seem to be the states that are doing better for Donald Trump in polling than some of the Rust Belt region. But it isn't because he's taking on the stances like the ones he is right now with the RNC and Mike Johnson. When you take a look at Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona, again, these are states Donald Trump would win today if the election was held today. It would be a very good showing, and it would put Donald Trump 2 electoral votes away from winning the presidency. But when you adopt ideologies like this one, when you perpetuate things that have turned off your base before, just at a time that you are winning them back, when Americans are upset with what is happening at the southern border, when Americans are upset with what is happening in the Middle East, when Americans are upset with President Biden and his approval rating is in the low 40s and sometimes high 30s, you should be able to clear the Electoral College map. And technically speaking, Donald Trump could, but he won't. Because he continues to take these extremely unpopular stances. He continues to let go of an election that he very, very clearly lost. And I think when you look at it in comparison to, what he could be focusing on this time around, it becomes apparent that the Trump campaign and the RNC and the Speaker of the House all colluding in this effort to push this narrative that the 2020 election was stolen shows that they are stuck in this echo chamber, an echo chamber that could very well lose them the election. It is Donald Trump's election to lose. There are no metrics on the side of Joe Biden except for the ones that have been gathered over the past 3 months that show Biden opening up hundreds of more field offices than Donald Trump, show Joe Biden putting in hundreds of more millions of dollars in the general election for ad reserves, showing Joe Biden making major improvements over polls over the past 3 months that, if continued, would lead to a Joe Biden victory on November 5th, 2024. But beyond that, the standard conventional wisdom for this election, given the approval rating of President Biden, given the performance of Democrats in the midterms, given where we are in terms of Donald Trump's polling relative to 2020 and 2016, it should be a clean sweep for the former president. But evidently, it's not. And so I think they really need to reflect on this idea that the 2020 election is an issue that voters care about, because quite frankly, they do not. You look at, too, the issue of abortion, where the Trump campaign has really tried to get it right, and yet somehow has gotten it wrong every single time. This is a problem for the GOP. This association with the House speakership, with the RNC, and it is also trickling down to statewide parties that are now only electing Trump yes men. And that's a problem, because they were able to balance it in 2016. In full honesty, you look at that 2016 campaign, a beautiful campaign for the Trump team because of the fact they were able to temper Donald Trump with Mike Pence, temper him with more conservatives coming back with the Comey letter. Everything had to work correctly for Hillary Clinton to lose the election. And that's exactly what happened. But it didn't happen in 2020. But at this point, it was a loyalty test to the GOP. Do they distance themselves from Trump, or they do adopt his ideology that this election was stolen? And they chose the latter. And so as a result, elections have been lost in subsequent years. In 2022, when you take a look at the 2023 election results, in governor races where Democrats should have never been able to win in a red wave year, and the House, which almost stayed with Democratic control despite it being a year where Kevin McCarthy was boasting Republicans might pick up 50 to 60 seats. There's a problem in the GOP, and it all stems from one person, Should he win the election, I think it would really solidify this for the remainder of the election cycle, remainder of this decade, at least this decade, maybe the next. But I think if he loses, it might call a whole number of things into reconsideration. The question is, though, does it actually? Because that's what 2020 was supposed to do, but evidently that was not the case. So all eyes on the 2024 election, all eyes on how Donald Trump navigates this idea that the 2020 election was stolen, because if he continues as is, chances are he's probably going to lose this election entirely on his own. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.